I never thought my quiet life on the land my grandfather left me would turn into the kind of nightmare you only hear about in neighborhood gossip or see in some over-dramatic TV show. My land wasn't fancy, but it was mine. 3 generations of sweat, labor, and memory were tied into every tree and every fence post. I didn't need anyone telling me how to live on it. At least, that's what I thought, until the hoe came knocking. It started like so many stories do, with the sound of tires crunching against gravel on a summer afternoon. I was out by the chicken co-op, repairing the fence, sweat soaking through my shirt, when I looked up and saw a shiny black SUV coming slowly down my long driveway. Now, most people who come that far down my drive are either friends or delivery trucks. But this wasn't either. Out stepped a woman in a blazer, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, and a man clutching a clipboard like it was his lifeline. They walked straight toward me as if my land already belonged to them. The woman introduced herself as Melissa, the president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, and the man as Tom, her compliance officer. The names meant nothing to me, but the way they carried themselves told me everything. These weren't neighbors. These were enforcers of some imaginary kingdom, marching into a place they had no right to claim. Melissa launched into her speech with a smile that never touched her eyes. She said that my property technically fell within the boundaries of Cedar Ridge and that I was expected to join the HOA. She listed the so-called benefits: community upkeep, shared security, higher property values. It all sounded like a sales pitch rehearsed too many times. When she finally paused, I told her the truth as simply as I could. I wasn't interested. My land wasn't part of Cedar Ridge. My deed predated their subdivision, and no piece of paper they wrote was going to change that. But Tom, the clipboard man, cleared his throat and tried to correct me. He claimed membership was mandatory and pointed to some bylaws in his binder. I remember setting down my pliers, looking him dead in the eye, and saying, "My family's been here since the 50s. Your bylaws don't mean a thing on this land." That was when Melissa's smile faltered. Just for a second, the mask slipped. Her voice tightened when she said, "It would be unfortunate if your property became a problem for the community." And then they turned back to their SUV, the gravel spitting under their tires as they left. I should have known that wouldn't be the end. At first, it was little things. Envelopes began appearing in my mailbox, stamped with the Cedar Ridge logo. They listed violations that bordered on absurd: improper lawn maintenance, unauthorized livestock, unapproved exterior color. Each one came with a fine attached: $50 here, $100 there. I tossed them straight in the trash. Then the phone call started. Different voices, all repeating the same script: pay your dues, submit to inspections, cooperate as a good neighbor. I ignored them, figuring they'd get bored and move on. But then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Saturday. I was up on the roof fixing a gutter when I saw a white sedan pull into the drive. At first glance, it looked like a police car. My stomach tightened. 2 men got out dressed in dark uniforms, radios crackling at their belts. They carried themselves like officers, but something about them didn't sit right. The badges looked too new, too shiny. And their car? No plates, just a blank frame where the numbers should have been. "Sir," one of them called up to me, "we've had complaints about code violations on this property. We'll need to come inside and take a look." I climbed down the ladder slowly, heart pounding in my chest. "Which department are you with?" I asked. The taller one puffed out his chest. "Cedar Ridge Security Enforcement." That was all I needed to hear. These weren't cops. They were actors in costumes, sent by the HOA to scare me. "Get off my land," I said firmly. The shorter one smirked, as if he'd practiced it in the mirror. Failure to comply could result in fines or legal action. "We have authority here." I laughed in his face, though inside I was boiling. "Authority? You're impersonating officers. If you don't leave now, I'll call the real sheriff. Let's see how he feels about people playing dress-up with badges." They exchanged a look, hesitated, and then turned back to their sedan. No more threats. No more swagger. Just silence as they drove away. I stood there in the yard, fists clenched, watching the car disappear down my drive. That was the moment I realized what I was up against. This wasn't about grass height or ho-dos. This was about power. And they were willing to cross the line into criminal territory to get it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my deed spread out in front of me. I had read it dozens of times before, but this time I studied every word. That's when something strange caught my eye. A note in the legal description about easements and boundaries. I decided to check the county plat maps the following Monday, just to put my mind at ease. What I discovered nearly knocked me out of my chair. The Cedar Ridge HOA office, their pride, their headquarters, the building where they held every single board meeting, wasn't actually on their land. According to the maps, their entire office sat 100 feet over the property line. My property line, which meant their whole operation, their base of power, the place they strutted around like kings and queens of the neighborhood, was built on land they didn't even own. My land. I remember sitting in that stiff chair at the county office, staring at the plat map, and feeling something shift inside me. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they could bully me into submission. But now I held the one piece of information that could bring everything crashing down around them. The HOA had sent fake cops to intimidate me, but their entire empire was standing on stolen ground. And that was the moment I decided this story wasn't going to end the way they planned. The moment I walked out of the county office with that plat map in my hand, I knew the entire game had changed. Before, it was just me against an HOA that wouldn't stop sending letters, fines, and fake cops. Now, I had leverage. Real leverage. The kind that could topple their little empire overnight. But knowing you have power and deciding how to use it are two very different things. I didn't rush into their office waving papers around. No, I let the information simmer. I wanted to see what their next move would be. It didn't take long. A few days later, there was another knock at my door. This time, Melissa didn't bother with fake smiles or polite introductions. She stood there with her arms crossed, sunglasses hiding her eyes, and Tom lingering behind her like a shadow. "You've ignored multiple violation notices," she said flatly. "You're in serious arrears with the HOA. If you don't resolve this immediately, we'll be forced to take legal action." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, meeting her stare. "Melissa, let me make this simple. My land is not part of Cedar Ridge. Your fines, your notices, your bylaws, they don't apply here." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You can't just live outside the rules. Everyone else participates. Everyone else pays. Why should you get to freeload?" That word, freeload, lit a fire in my chest. My family had bled on this land long before her subdivision even existed. But I kept my voice calm, almost too calm. "Maybe you should take a closer look at your office before you come after me again." Her head tilted slightly, just enough to show I'd caught her off guard. But she didn't take the bait. She just tightened her grip on the folder she was holding and hissed, "You'll regret this stubbornness." Then she turned on her heel and walked away, Tom scurrying behind her. That was the first time I realized Melissa wasn't just some neighborhood busybody. She was used to getting her way. And when she didn't back down. She doubled down. The very next morning, I woke to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my front door. "Notice of lien," it said in bold letters, with a long list of supposed unpaid fines. Of course, it wasn't real. The HOA didn't have the authority to put a lien on my property, but they were hoping I wouldn't know that. They wanted to scare me into submission. What they didn't realize was that the more they pushed, the more determined I became to push back. I spent the next week preparing. I went back to the county office, made certified copies of every document, every map, every line of my deed. I even had a surveyor come out and confirm the boundaries. Sure enough, the survey stakes didn't lie. The HOA's office sat completely on my land. Not a corner, not a sliver, but the whole building. When I finally had the folder in my hands, thick with evidence, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. But still, I waited. Because sometimes the best move is patience. Let your opponent think they've got the upper hand before you flip the board. And flip it, I did. One evening, just before sunset, I decided to take a walk down to Cedar Ridge. I wanted to see their office for myself, not just on paper. The building looked exactly like I expected. An over-designed clubhouse with glass doors, a manicured lawn, and a big stone sign that read, Cedar Ridge HOA. For a moment, I stood across the street, imagining the look on their faces when they realized the entire place was sitting on land that didn't belong to them. As I watched, a couple of board members walked out, chatting and laughing, holding files under their arms. They looked so smug, so certain of their little kingdom. That was when it hit me. They weren't just trying to bully me. They were protecting themselves. Because deep down, maybe they knew. Maybe they'd always known. The following week, things escalated again. A letter arrived in my mailbox, this one stamped with something meant to look official, Cedar Ridge Legal Department. Inside was a demand, pay $3,200 in fines or face legal consequences. I couldn't help but laugh. They were bluffing, throwing numbers around, trying to drown me in fear. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Instead of responding to their threats, I drafted a letter of my own. Short, direct, and devastating, I attached copies of the deed, the plat maps, and the survey. Then, in bold at the top, I wrote, Notice of unauthorized occupancy. Cedar Ridge office building located on my property. I didn't mail it. No, that would have been too easy. Too quiet. I wanted them to feel it. So one afternoon, I walked right up to their office, pushed through those glass doors, and dropped the envelope directly onto Melissa's desk. The silence in that room when she opened it was something I'll never forget. Her face went pale as she scanned the papers, and for once, the perfect composure cracked. This isn't possible, she whispered. Oh, it's very possible, I said calmly. Your headquarters is sitting on my land, which means every meeting you've held, every decision you've made in this building, has been done while trespassing on private property. My property. Tom tried to bluster, insisting their lawyers would sort it out, that I didn't understand the situation. But the truth was written right there in black and white, and they knew it. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so everyone in the room had to strain to hear. You came to my door. You sent fake cops. You tried to intimidate me with lies. But you forgot one thing. You built your castle on sand. And now the tide's coming in. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Melissa slammed the folder shut, forcing her confidence back into place. We'll see you in court, she snapped. I smiled. Oh, I'm counting on it. When I walked out of that office, the air felt lighter. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't the one being hunted. They were. And they knew it. That night, sitting on my porch with the stars overhead, I thought about how quickly life had changed. Just a few weeks earlier, I was worried about fixing fences and mowing grass. Now, I was preparing for a battle that could decide the future of my land. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because I held the truth. And the truth was, the HOA's entire foundation, literally and figuratively, belonged to me. And I was done playing defense. The morning after I dropped that folder on Melissa's desk, I woke up with a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. Satisfaction, because I'd finally thrown their arrogance back in their faces. Dread, because people like Melissa don't just roll over. They don't admit defeat. They come back harder, meaner, and more desperate. And sure enough, the first sign of retaliation came faster than I expected. I drove into town later that week to pick up supplies, and on the way back I noticed a bright new sign posted right at the entrance of Cedar Ridge. In big, bold letters it read, Warning, non-compliant property in violation of HOA standards. And right below it, with an arrow pointing toward my driveway, they had actually listed my address. It felt surreal, standing there in my truck, staring at a public shaming campaign against me as if I were some criminal. I could imagine the board sitting around that stolen office of theirs, congratulating themselves on their clever idea, thinking this would turn the community against me. And the worst part? It worked. That afternoon, as I worked in the yard, I noticed people slowing their cars as they passed, pointing, whispering, some even shaking their heads. Neighbors who used to wave now kept their distance. A few days later, I caught one of them snapping pictures of my house from the street, no doubt reporting back to Melissa like a loyal soldier. The HOA wasn't just trying to break me financially with their fake fines. They were trying to isolate me, to strip away any sense of belonging, until I either gave in or packed up and left. But if they thought I'd cave that easily, they didn't know who they were dealing with. A few days later, another envelope arrived in the mail, this one thicker than the usual violation slips. Inside was a stack of papers stamped with words meant to terrify. Notice of pending litigation. According to the letter, Cedar Ridge HOA was preparing to sue me for failure to comply with community standards, unauthorized land use, and obstruction of HOA authority. It was laughable. They didn't have a legal leg to stand on. But that didn't matter. Their goal wasn't to win. It was to drain me, to bury me under so much stress, paperwork, and expense that I'd eventually fold. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, staring at the stack of papers, and feeling my jaw tighten. They wanted me tired. They wanted me broke. They wanted me humiliated. But what they didn't realize was that every attack only made me stronger. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every phone call, every sign they posted, every dirty trick they tried. I took photos, made copies, logged dates and times. If they wanted to drag this fight into the open, then I was going to make sure the truth came with me. Still, the pressure wasn't easy to bear. It wasn't just the hoe anymore, it was the entire neighborhood. People I'd known for years began to avoid me. A woman I'd once helped dig her car out of a ditch crossed the street rather than say hello. Kids who used to fish in my creek weren't allowed near my property anymore. It was as if Melissa had declared me an enemy of the people, and her loyal subjects were all too happy to follow. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when a truck slowed down at the end of my drive. The driver leaned out the window and shouted, "Why don't you just pay up and stop causing trouble for everyone?" Then he drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and the faint sound of laughter behind him. That was the first time I truly felt the weight of being alone in this fight. But even in that moment, a thought kept me going. They were hiding something. People don't fight this dirty unless they've got something to lose. And I already knew what it was. Their entire office was sitting on my land. If I played this right, the very ground they stood on would collapse beneath them. A week later, the hoe tried another stunt. This time, I woke up to the sound of engines. When I looked out the window, I saw two trucks parked on the edge of my property. Men in reflective vests were unloading equipment, hammering signs into the dirt. When I walked down there, I saw what they were putting up. Future site of Community Park Cedar Ridge HOA. They were claiming my land again. Not just with words, but with signs, equipment, and plans. I marched up to the nearest worker and said, "Whose authority do you think you're building under?" He barely looked at me. "Orders from the whole board. We're just following instructions." I yanked the signpost straight out of the ground and threw it onto the back of their truck. "Well, my orders are for you to leave. This is private property. And if you don't get off now, the sheriff will explain the rest to you." The men exchanged uneasy looks, then packed up their gear and left. But I knew they'd be back. This wasn't a one-off stunt. This was war. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running every possible outcome through my head. They wanted to push me until I cracked, until I made a mistake they could exploit. But if I stayed calm, if I played my cards right, I had the one weapon they could never match: the truth. The truth that their entire office building, their castle, their throne room, was sitting on stolen ground. The next morning, I started planning my next move. I called a lawyer, explained the situation, and handed over every document I'd collected. He listened carefully, nodding slowly, and then said something that made my blood run cold. "You realize what this means, don't you?" he asked. I nodded. "It means their office belongs to me." He leaned forward. "Not just belongs. It means you could evict them. You could have the entire building torn down if you wanted." I sat there, stunned, imagining the look on Melissa's face if she ever heard those words from a judge. Her empire, her board meetings, her seat of power, gone, bulldozed into dust because she built it on land that wasn't hers. But part of me knew it wouldn't be that simple. People like Melissa don't give up power without a fight. They would claw, scratch, and drag the entire neighborhood into chaos before admitting defeat. And that's exactly what they did. The smear campaign against me went into overdrive. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, painting me as some stubborn recluse standing in the way of community progress. They accused me of being a danger to property values, of letting my land fall into disrepair, even of being hostile toward my neighbors. Every lie spread like wildfire, and soon I couldn't walk into town without feeling the weight of eyes on me. But through it all, I kept one thing in mind. Truth doesn't need allies to stand tall. And the truth was on my side. So I waited. I watched. I gathered evidence. And quietly, in the background, I began preparing the one move that would change everything. Because while Melissa and her board were busy spreading lies about me, they were sitting in a building that wasn't theirs. And sooner or later, I was going to remind them of that in a way they would never forget. If I thought the hoe had reached their limit, I was dead wrong. What came next proved that Melissa and her board were willing to burn everything to the ground just to hold on to their illusion of control. The first sign came in the form of a letter, thicker and heavier than anything they'd sent before. It arrived in a large manila envelope, the kind that makes your heart drop when you pull it from the mailbox. Across the front were the words, Cedar Ridge HOA Legal Action Court Summons. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it slowly, half expecting some cheap scare tactic. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Inside were documents filled with legal jargon, claiming I was being sued for breach of contract, failure to comply with HOA bylaws, and endangerment of community welfare. It looked official, stamped and signed, but the deeper I read, the clearer it became. It was a fabrication. A carefully crafted piece of theater meant to trick me into believing I was already knee-deep in a lawsuit. But here's the thing about lies. Once you spot the first one, the rest unravel quickly. The supposed case number didn't exist. The court seal was nothing more than a photocopied image. Even the attorney's name listed at the bottom couldn't be found anywhere in the state bar registry. They hadn't just bent the truth. They had created an entire fake legal document and shoved it into my mailbox, hoping I'd panic and fold. That night, as I sat there with the papers spread across the table, I felt the anger boiling up inside me again. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was fraud, and they were too arrogant to even hide it well. I called my lawyer first thing the next morning. He flipped through the documents, shook his head, and chuckled bitterly. This wouldn't hold up in a traffic court, let alone a civil one. They're bluffing. But make no mistake, they're trying to push you to the edge. If you weren't paying attention, you might have thought this was real. His words were meant to reassure me, but they only made me more determined. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then I was going to drag their every dirty trick into the light. But they weren't finished. Not by a long shot. A few days later, I heard the sound of tires crunching on my driveway again. I stepped outside, bracing myself, and saw two county sheriff's cruisers pulling up. Real ones this time. My heart sank. This wasn't like the fake cops in dark uniforms from before. These were actual deputies wearing the county badge. When they stepped out, one of them was even a man I recognized, someone I'd seen around town for years. "Morning," he said carefully. "We got a complaint from the Cedar Ridge HOA about some kind of disturbance. Said you threatened their workers and damaged HOA property." I almost laughed. Almost. Their property? You mean the sign they illegally hammered into my land? The deputies exchanged a look. One of them flipped open his notepad. "Look, we're not here to pick sides. We just need to figure out what's going on. They're saying you've been hostile, that you're refusing to comply with community standards." I felt my jaw tighten. This was exactly what Melissa wanted, to paint me as some angry lunatic causing trouble for everyone else, so when the law showed up, they'd be inclined to believe her. But I was ready. I went inside, grabbed my folder of documents, and came back out. I laid everything out on the hood of one of their cruisers. My deed, the surveyor's report, the county plat maps, and finally, the copies proving that the Cedar Ridge office building was sitting on my property. The deputies skimmed the papers, their brows furrowing deeper with every page. When they reached the last document, one of them let out a low whistle. "Wait a second," he muttered. "Are you telling us the HOA office is actually built on your land?" I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. and I've got the legal proof to back it up. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Then the older deputy closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Well," he said slowly, "this changes things. Look, we'll file a report, but it sounds like the HOA's complaints don't hold much water. Just keep everything documented. Don't give them any excuse to twist this around." And with that, they got back into their cruisers and drove off, leaving me standing in the driveway with the sun beating down on my shoulders. For the first time, the HOA's lies hadn't stuck. For the first time, someone outside my world had seen the truth. And that gave me a glimmer of hope. But of course, Melissa didn't stop. If she couldn't break me with fake lawsuits or scare me with deputies, she was going to try something worse, turning the entire neighborhood into a weapon. Within a week, flyers started appearing in mailboxes around town. I got my hands on one, crumpled and weathered, and when I unfolded it, my stomach churned. Warning: dangerous neighbor. Refuses to comply with community standards. Known to be hostile and aggressive, avoid contact. And below that, in bold letters, my name, my address, even a blurry photo of me standing in my yard. It was slander, pure and simple, but it worked. People who used to nod at me in the grocery store now avoided me like I carried some kind of disease. Parents pulled their kids away if they wandered too close to my property line. Neighbors I'd helped over the years now crossed the street when they saw me coming. It's one thing to fight an HOA in a boardroom. It's another thing entirely to fight them in the court of public opinion, where lies spread faster than truth and reputations can be destroyed overnight. There were nights I lay awake wondering if it was worth it, wondering if I should just sell the land, walk away, and leave this nightmare behind. But every time that thought crossed my mind, I pictured my grandfather's hands, calloused and strong, hammering boards into the frame of this house. I pictured the oak tree where my father used to sit and tell me stories as a kid. I pictured the creek where I caught my first fish. This land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was my history, my family's history, and no amount of bullying was going to take that from me. So instead of folding, I started planning my counterstrike. My lawyer and I began drafting the paperwork for what's known as an ejectment action, a legal demand to remove trespassers from private property. If it went through, the Cedar Ridge HOA would be legally forced to vacate their office building. That meant their entire operation would collapse overnight. But timing was everything. If I filed too soon, Melissa would rally her troops and spin it as another attack against the community. If I waited too long, the HOA might find a way to dig in even deeper. So I decided to bide my time, to let them believe their smear campaign was working, while I built my case stronger than ever. And during those long nights of planning, I couldn't help but think about what it would feel like to walk into court, stand in front of a judge, and watch the entire Cedar Ridge board realize that the ground beneath them had never been theirs to begin with. The same ground they had used to intimidate me. The same ground they had used to hold meetings, pass fines, and send fake cops to my door. It was all mine. And soon, everyone would know it. If the fake lawsuits and smear flyers were meant to break me, then what came next was their attempt at total war. It started small, with whispers around town. A neighbor would wave at me one day, then suddenly pretend not to see me the next. The cashier at the local market, who used to chat with me about fishing, suddenly stopped making eye contact. People I had known for years now treated me like some kind of outlaw. Melissa and the whole board weren't just spreading rumors anymore. They were orchestrating a campaign. They wanted me isolated, hated, and most of all, exhausted. One morning, as I pulled out of my driveway, I noticed a car idling at the edge of the road. A black SUV with tinted windows. It didn't belong to anyone I recognized, and when I drove down the street, it followed. Not close enough to be obvious, but close enough that I could feel the weight of its presence in my rearview mirror. It followed me all the way into town, parked across the street while I went into the hardware store, and then trailed me halfway back home before peeling off suddenly. The next day, the same SUV appeared again. I wasn't paranoid. I knew what was happening. The HOA had gone from fake cops to what looked suspiciously like hired intimidation. and I wasn't about to let them see me rattled. Instead, I began documenting everything: photos, notes, even voice recordings when possible. Every flyer I found, every car that loitered near my driveway, every anonymous letter slipped under my door, I logged it all. If they wanted to drag me through the mud, I was going to show a court exactly how far they'd gone. But the pressure wasn't just on me. It was spreading to the people around me. One evening, I got a call from my cousin who lived a few miles down the road. He sounded uneasy. "Hey, look, I don't know what's going on with you in the Ho, but some people came by the other day. They said you were dangerous, that I should stay away. They even hinted I could get dragged into it if I wasn't careful." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tight. "They're lying, Dan. Every word of it. They're just trying to cut me off from everyone." "I figured," he said quietly. "But you should know, they're putting real effort into this. They've got people knocking on doors, talking to folks. It's not just flyers anymore." That confirmed what I already suspected. Melissa wasn't satisfied with passive-aggressive tactics. She was mobilizing. She was turning the neighborhood into her army, brick by brick. And then, as if things weren't already tense enough, came the confrontation that nearly pushed me over the edge. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was mowing my lawn. The steady hum of the mower was the one thing that kept my mind from spiraling into anger. But then I saw them, Melissa and two of her board members, standing at the edge of my yard. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. They just stood there, arms folded, glaring at me like I was some kind of criminal. I shut off the mower, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and walked over. "Can I help you?" I asked flatly. Melissa smirked. "We're here to remind you, once again, that you're in violation of community bylaws. Your grass is half an inch taller than regulation. Your fencing doesn't meet approved standards. And frankly, your hostility toward your neighbors is unacceptable." I laughed, an actual, sharp laugh that seemed to catch her off guard. "You do realize none of your rules apply to me, right? You're standing on my land right now, accusing me of breaking bylaws that don't even exist here." Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Maybe not for long," she said. "You think you found some loophole, but the community has spoken. They don't want you here. And soon, you'll have no choice but to comply or leave." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Melissa, I know about the office. I know where it sits. You've been running your little empire from my property this entire time. And when the court sees the evidence, you and your board are going to be the ones packing boxes, not me." Her face drained of color. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by something I hadn't seen before: fear. One of her board members muttered, "He knows." Melissa quickly recovered, but her voice cracked when she snapped, "We'll see about that." Then they turned and walked off, but not before I caught the flicker of panic in her eyes. That was the moment I knew I had her. For the first time, Melissa realized the game wasn't in her favor anymore. But desperate people make desperate moves. 2 days later, my lawyer called. "We've got a problem. Someone filed a counterclaim in your name." I frowned. "What do you mean, in my name?" He sighed. "Exactly that. They submitted paperwork to the county clerk pretending to be you, basically a fake filing saying you admitted fault and agreed to hold jurisdiction. Luckily, the clerk flagged it because the signature didn't match. But if it had slipped through, my blood went cold. They weren't just lying anymore. They were forging. They were willing to commit outright fraud, even felony-level crimes, just to keep their grip on power." I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for a long time. Every trick they pulled only hardened my resolve. They thought they were clever, hiding behind fake lawsuits, fake cops, forged papers, and gossip. But every move they made left a trail, and every trail was a nail in their coffin. That night, I spread out everything I had collected across the dining room table: photos of the fake officers, copies of the bogus legal documents, screenshots of the smear flyers, witness statements from the deputies who had realized the office was on my property, and now, proof that someone had attempted to forge a legal filing in my name. Piece by piece, I was building a mountain of evidence. A story so undeniable that not even Melissa's silver tongue could twist it away. And when the day came, I was going to march into that courtroom and tear down everything the Cedar Ridge Ho had built, literally and figuratively. But before I could, they had one last card to play. Late one evening, as I sat on the porch sipping coffee, I saw a movement by the Ho office building. At first, I thought it was just someone locking up for the night. But then I noticed the shadows didn't move like office staff. They moved like people sneaking, crouching low, carrying something heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it across the field. 3 figures froze in the beam, caught like deer. In their hands were boxes, file boxes, stuffed full of papers. When the light hit them, they bolted, sprinting into the night. The boxes tipped, spilling documents across the grass before they vanished into the dark. I hurried over and picked up what I could. And when I saw what was inside, my pulse quickened. They weren't carrying ordinary paperwork. They were carrying Ho records, financial statements, meeting minutes, even private emails. And from the looks of it, they weren't moving them for safekeeping. They were trying to get rid of them. Why? Because those records held the truth. And now I had them. Standing there in the moonlight, clutching the files against my chest, I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. The Cedar Ridge Ho wasn't just corrupt. They were rotten to the core. And if I played this right, I wasn't just going to save my land. I was going to expose them for everything they had done to me and to everyone else. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I actually smiled. Because now the end game was coming. The night I found those files scattered across the grass, everything changed. Up until then, I had been reacting, defending myself, pushing back, trying to survive wave after wave of the HOA's attacks. But now I was the one holding the matchbook, and they were standing in a house soaked in gasoline. I spent hours going through the boxes. At first, it was the usual, meeting agendas, petty fines issued against neighbors, lists of approved lawn decorations. But the deeper I dug, the uglier it got. There were notes about residents who had fallen behind on dues, with callous comments about how to pressure them into paying. There were emails between Melissa and board members, bragging about intimidating elderly homeowners into voluntary compliance. And then there was the financial ledger. That was the bombshell. Payments that didn't add up. Dues collected that mysteriously vanished. Expenses listed for maintenance that had never actually happened. The Cedar Ridge Ho wasn't just corrupt. It was bleeding the community dry while Melissa lined her pockets. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the stack of papers in disbelief. Everything I had endured, the fake cops, the bogus lawsuits, the smear campaigns, it wasn't just about me refusing to join. It was about power, control, and money. Always money. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Instead, I organized the documents, labeling everything, highlighting the most damning details. By dawn, I had a binder thicker than a phone book, every page a nail in the HOA's coffin. My liar's eyes nearly popped out of his head when I slid the binder across his desk the next morning. He flipped through a few pages, let out a low whistle, and leaned back in his chair. This is enough to bury them. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power, hell, even harassment charges. Melissa's not just going to lose her position. She's going to be lucky if she doesn't end up in jail. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But there was still work to do. We filed the ejectment action, officially demanding the Ho vacate their office from my property. Along with it, we attached the evidence from the files, proof of fraud, misuse of funds, and abuse of authority. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a full-blown case against the Cedar Ridge Ho itself. When word got out, the neighborhood erupted. Some people were still skeptical, but others, those who had been quietly crushed under Melissa's iron fist, started whispering about their own experiences. An elderly couple admitted the Ho had threatened to foreclose on their home over an unpaid $75 fee. A single mother confessed she'd been fined repeatedly for unauthorized decorations every time her kids drew chalk art on the driveway. The lies were cracking. The illusion of authority was crumbling, and Melissa knew it. She showed up at my property one afternoon, unannounced. No entourage this time. No smug board members flanking her. Just Melissa standing on the edge of my driveway, her usual confidence gone. I walked out to meet her, cautious but curious. "Why are you here?" I asked. She crossed her arms, but her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "You don't have to do this. You've made your point. You've embarrassed us enough. Just stop. We can work something out." I shook my head. "You want me to stop after everything you've done? After the fake cops, the forged documents, the harassment? No, this isn't just about me anymore. You've been bullying this neighborhood for years. People deserve to know the truth." Her face hardened again, but her eyes betrayed her fear, desperation. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming off. But her threat didn't carry the same weight anymore. Not when I had the truth on my side. The court date came faster than I expected. The Cedar Ridge HOA packed into the small county courtroom, Melissa front and center in her signature blazer. She tried to act composed, but the twitch in her jaw gave her away. When the judge called our case, my lawyer laid everything out like a perfectly woven story. First, the property lines, the indisputable fact that the HOA's office sat squarely on my land. Then, the harassment, photos, recordings, false documents. And finally, the knockout punch, the financial records. Page after page of embezzlement, misuse of funds, evidence of residents being extorted. Every revelation landed like a hammer blow, and with each one, the room grew quieter. Melissa tried to object, tried to argue, but the judge shut her down. "You'll have your chance," he said sternly. When her turn came, her lawyer floundered. He tried to dismiss the evidence as misunderstood, but the numbers didn't lie. He tried to paint me as a disgruntled neighbor with a grudge, but the judge had already seen too much. And then, the final straw. The forged filing. My lawyer presented the clerk's testimony, proving someone had tried to submit a fake legal document in my name. The judge's expression turned from neutral to stone. "This is serious. Very serious. If this is connected to the HOA board, there will be criminal consequences." Melissa's face went pale. She whispered something to her lawyer, who shook his head grimly. By the end of the day, the ruling was clear. The HOA was ordered to vacate their office immediately, the land officially recognized as mine. On top of that, the court ordered a full audit of Cedar Ridge's finances and an investigation into the board's conduct. It was over, or at least, the battle was won. The war, the fallout, was just beginning. News of the ruling spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now came to my door, some with apologies, some with stories of their own mistreatment. One man broke down crying, admitting he had almost lost his home because of Melissa's fines. The black SUV stopped showing up. The flyers disappeared. The whispers turned into open discussions about how much damage the HOA had caused. And Melissa? She vanished. Resigned from the board, packed up her things, and left Cedar Ridge practically overnight. But not before I saw her one last time. I was sitting on my porch when her car rolled past. She didn't stop, didn't roll down the window. But our eyes met for a brief moment, and in that fleeting glance, I saw it all: anger, humiliation, fear, and maybe, just maybe, the realization that her empire had been built on a lie, and one stubborn neighbor refusing to bow had been enough to topple it. I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. The land was mine again. The office would be torn down. The truth was out. But even as the sun dipped behind the trees and the crickets began to sing, I knew this story wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an HOA. Every person who had been told they had no power, no choice, no voice. And it was proof that sometimes, no matter how stacked the odds, one person standing their ground can bring down an entire empire. The morning after the ruling, I walked across my land for the first time without a weight pressing on my chest. The air felt cleaner, lighter, like the ground itself had been waiting for this moment of release. The Cedar Ridge Home office, once a fortress of intimidation, now sat like a hollow shell. Its windows were dark, its parking lot empty. For years, that building had been the symbol of Melissa's power. Now, it was nothing more than a monument to arrogance, a reminder of how fragile false authority really is when it's built on lies. County officials arrived a few days later to begin the process of dismantling the office. I stood nearby as workers hauled out file cabinets, chairs, and desks, stacking them on the curb like discarded relics. Neighbors gathered too, watching quietly, some with grim satisfaction, others with guilt etched on their faces. For a while, nobody spoke. Then an older man, Mr. Henderson, shuffled up beside me. He had been one of Melissa's staunchest supporters. He cleared his throat awkwardly before muttering, "Guess we should have listened to you from the start." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I just nodded and said, "What matters is that you see the truth now." One by one, more neighbors approached. Apologies, confessions, even gratitude. People who had once turned away from me now looked me in the eye. It didn't erase the months of isolation and slander, but it was something, a start. The biggest surprise came from the elderly couple down the road, the ones the HOA had threatened with foreclosure. They brought me a homemade pie, tears in their eyes. "You didn't just fight for yourself," the woman whispered. "You fought for all of us." Their words hit me harder than I expected. Because deep down, that was the truth. This battle had never really been about me alone. It had been about standing up to bullies who thought they could rewrite the rules of ownership and freedom. Melissa, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. The investigation into the HOA's finances exposed her schemes in detail: embezzlement, misuse of dues, intimidation tactics. There was even talk of criminal charges, though by then she had already skipped town. The empire she built crumbled overnight, leaving nothing but bitterness in her wake. As for Cedar Ridge itself, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. Without the HOA's iron grip, residents started organizing informally, true community efforts, not rules imposed by fear. Barbecues replaced board meetings. Conversations replaced threats. And me? I stayed right where I was. I fixed up the fence line, planted new grass where the HOA office had once stood, and reclaimed my land inch by inch. Some evenings, I'd sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and just watch the sun dip behind the trees, finally able to enjoy the peace that had been stolen from me for so long. But the fight left scars. There were nights I still woke up sweating, heart racing, dreaming of fake cops knocking at my door or Melissa's voice sneering about bylaws that never applied. There were moments I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting that black SUV to reappear. Yet each time, I reminded myself, it was over. The land was mine. The truth had won. And though the battle had nearly broken me, it had also taught me something invaluable: that standing your ground, even when you're outnumbered and outgunned, can change everything. Neighbors still stop by sometimes, asking me to tell the story again. Some shake their heads in disbelief. Others laugh at the absurdity of it all: fake cops, forged lawsuits, and HOA office built on the wrong land. And every time, I tell them the same thing. They thought they owned me, but in the end, I owned them. It wasn't just a victory over Cedar Ridge. It was proof that bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, crumble when faced with truth and persistence. And so, as I look out over the field where that office once stood, I know one thing for certain. This land will never again be a weapon in someone else's war. It will remain what it always was: home. Home, and proof that sometimes one voice saying no is louder than 100 shouting yes.